Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I propose we start. Welcome to this first webinar in the series, The Value of Water in Canada, organized for the second year since we started in 2022. We're very happy to have you all with us again this year. Before I start introducing the speaker of today, I want to start by acknowledging that we're participating today from traditional territories of the First People. I participate today from land that is part of the traditional territory of the Neutro Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. University of Waterloo is located on land granted to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River as part of the Haldimand Treaty. University of Waterloo and its centers and institutes like the Water Institute are committed to raise awareness and contribute to Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls for action. So the speaker of today is Dr. John Hartig. I'll do a very brief introduction and then hand over to him. Dr. Hartig is currently a visiting scholar at the Great Lakes Institute for Environmental Research at the University of Windsor. During 2017-2018, he was a Fulbright scholar at the Basile School of International Affairs here in Waterloo. The focus of his Fulbright was interdisciplinary research on the cleanup of the Great Lakes. For 14 years, he served as refugee manager for the Detroit River International Wildlife Refuge, and John also serves on the board of directors of the Detroit Riverfront Conservancy. Questioning how science fits into public decision-making for the Great Lakes and questioning how he can personally make a difference in helping develop a stewardship ethic for the Great Lakes, his life journey led him to become an award-winning nonfiction writer of 8 books, no less, and the last one was published last fall called The Great Lakes Champions. In 2020, he also led a paper published in the Journal of Great Lakes Research, providing a great review of 35 years of restoring the Great Lakes areas of concern. More generally speaking, his focus is on accelerating the sustainability transition and inspiring the next generation of environmentalists, conservationists, and sustainability entrepreneurs in urban areas, because that's where most people nowadays on our planet live. And in today's webinar, John will talk about the ecosystem approach in the 21st century to guide science and management of the Great Lakes. John, we're very happy to have you with us today, and I'm very happy to hand over the floor to you.
Thanks, Roy, for having us. Really a pleasure to be back virtually at the University of Waterloo. What I'm going to talk about, as Roy said today, is the ecosystem approach in the 21st century. It's been around a long time, and we convened we're going to give you a little primer on the ecosystem approach to get started, and then we're going to ask you, is it still relevant to you and your work? In what ways is it relevant and actionable, and what recommendations would you like to put forward to governments and others on better implementing the ecosystem approach? We'll share a link at the end of our presentation today where a survey will give you, if you're willing to, please fill out a short survey. It doesn't have to be done today, but in the next few days to a week, if you could, while it's still fresh in your mind, if you could fill out that survey, we'd really appreciate it. So we have a team here working at the Great Lakes Institute for Environmental Research, led by Catherine Febria and her in her Healthy Headwaters lab. We also have myself is on the team, and Basha Pyro, who's a PhD student on this project, and Fani Sarucha, who's a research assistant as well. So the ecosystem approach has legitimacy. Think about it. It's in the U.S. Clean Water Act. It's in the Canada Water Act refers to it. The Canada-U.S. Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, the United Nations, the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, the International Joint Commission, Environment Climate Change Canada, US EPA, the US Fish and Wildlife Service, and NOAA, all. So it's well embedded in our institutional frameworks. So an ecosystem approach is both a way of thinking and a way of acting. In terms of a way of thinking, an ecosystem approach accounts for the interrelationships among air, water, and land and all living things, including you and I, because we are part of the ecosystem, and it involves all user groups, stakeholder groups in management. So I like to explain the difference between environment and ecosystem is like the difference between house and home. House is external and detached. It sits across the street over there. But a home, as you see, is something you see yourself in, even when you're not there. So an ecosystem approach recognizes that humans are in the ecosystem. It acknowledges the interconnectedness. It pursues sustainability, works to understand unique places and integrate processes, and involve, of course, stakeholders. A little fun cartoon: if there was an ecosystem approach to driving school, there would probably be 4 steering wheels. But an ecosystem approach is also a way of acting, involving all user groups in management means multi-stakeholder roundtables. This also requires team building and shared governance. A good example is Great Lakes Areas of Concern. These 43 pollution hotspots throughout the Great Lakes, and you see some of the logos of the unique ones on the bottom down there. But prior to 1985, governments were used to implementing programs in a top-down command and control fashion. Think about it: issuing permits, water discharge permits, and control orders, and doing that, prescribing what had to be done. But this changes it and shifts it to bottom up, a more collaborative approach to identifying problems and solving them. So top down is centralized control, autocratic, hierarchical, the style of command and control decision making. Bottom up is no centralized control, as you see on the right-hand side of your screen, shared decision making, depicted usually as partnerships and networks. So how this came to be manifested in areas of concern were through these remedial action plan institutional structures. A remedial action plan, or a RAP, is the plan to clean up the area of concern. So they are broadly representative of the social, economic, environmental interests in each area. And, you know, some examples are the Bay Area Restoration Council down in Hamilton, Cuyahoga River Restoration in Cleveland, and some of the public advisory committees. It obviously, collaboration is essential. There is no single best way of implementing the ecosystem approach in these remedial action plans for areas of concern. It's fair to say that there are 43 locally designed, place-based ecosystem approaches that involve stakeholders, foster cooperative learning, share decision-making, co-produce knowledge, and co-innovate solutions, and ensure local ownership. You know, each of these were kind of, they tried to structure these RAP institutional structures to be locally owned, not owned by the federal government, the provincial, or the state government, but just be locally owned, because that's where the action would be for cleanup. There are many boundaries and barriers to use of an ecosystem approach and ecosystem-based management. Some of them are disciplinary, the difference between natural scientists, engineers, and social scientists. There can be political boundaries, there can be geographical boundaries. So the concept of a boundary organization has been introduced to describe specific organizational efforts to overcome these barriers and mediate between science and policy. Sometimes you'll see this as they are called boundary actors, and in some cases, boundary spanners. Similarly, you'll see the idea of a boundary organization network that works across traditional boundaries to strengthen science policy management linkages. for ecosystem-based management. Here's one example of a boundary organization network. It was not a single organization, but all of these had to come together and work together under the remedial action plan. So you've got here for the Rouge River in Southeast Michigan. This is not the Rouge River from Toronto, but the one from Southeast Michigan, and you have US EPA and Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, and their Department of Natural Resources, the Friends of the Rouge. All 48 communities were at the table, all 48 communities, 3 counties, industries, schools, all of them work together. Each of these processes requires cooperative learning that involves stakeholders working in teams to accomplish a common goal under conditions that involve positive interdependence. That is, all stakeholders cooperate to complete a task, and individual and a group accountability. Each stakeholder is accountable for the final outcome. Also essential to these processes is adaptive management, where you perform an ecosystem health assessment, you set priorities, you take actions in an iterative fashion for continuous improvement. Most of the problems in the Great Lakes are people problems. So ecological restoration is about solving ecosystem problems through people management. Actionable science, is research that is undertaken with stakeholders to better inform decisions and the design and implementation of policy programs and planning and behaviors that affect the ecosystem. Strengths of actionable science are co-production of knowledge and co-innovation of solutions. You'll hear that a lot in ecosystem-based management and ecosystem approach. So good examples of co-production of knowledge is here at the Great Lakes Institute for Environmental Research. Our research scientists and faculty have been involved for over 30 years in the assessment of contaminated sediment problems in the Detroit River and setting priorities for management, reviewing options. Really good example of co-production of knowledge. Another good one is Canada Center for Inland Waters and McMaster University's involvement in first identifying loss of fish and wildlife habitat in Hamilton Harbor, and then reviewing options and restoring habitats in Hamilton Harbor. One of the better examples of co-innovation of solutions is the Don River Mouth Naturalization and Portland's Flood Protection Project up in Toronto. Most of us know that the Don River was straightened for convenience. It was channelized, it was paved and built over. It was polluted with municipal industrial waste and land runoff to the point that it caught on fire twice. So co-innovation of solutions led to a $1.25 billion project to bring back the Don and restore the east waterfront, constructing new naturalized river mouth through the Portlands and creating a new urban island neighborhood called Villiers Island. It also providing flood protection for 593 acres of Toronto's eastern waterfront, adding 40 acres of new parkland and creating 36 acres of new aquatic habitats. They also quantified the benefits of this, and this project will generate about $1.1 billion in value to the Canadian economy, over 10,000 person years of employment, and 373 million in tax revenue just to all levels of government. But the ecosystem approach, as we all know, is hard work and time consuming. Some of the criticisms of the ecosystem approach are that it is a loose collection of ideas and it needs a framework. There's a diversity of terminology. it often fails to be predicted. Quantitative forecasting of human behavior and lack of cultural diversity. So this idea of needing a framework, obviously a framework arose out of this remedial action plan program for Great Lakes areas of concern. And critical steps in the process were ensuring meaningful stakeholder participation and dialogue towards a desired future state for the area of concern, engaging local leaders and recruiting a high-profile champion, establishing a compelling vision that can be carried in the hearts and minds of people, and clear and measurable goals, also measurable targets for removing use impairments and delisting the area of concern, practicing adaptive management involving researchers, and building partnerships, pursuing creative and collaborative financing, and then quantifying benefits. Here's how it looks in a flow chart, where you start out and you bring everyone together and you develop your vision statement, you secure the commitment of top leaders, you agree on information needs and opportunity or problem definition, based on a comprehensive assessment. Then you sort of do this action planning within a strategic plan framework, identify objectives, set priorities, define benchmarks, identify options, select your preferred options that become your actions, identify who's responsible and when, and then you develop the sequencing. Then you go out and you implement, you monitor the results, you do some rigorous review of your results, and you ask the question, have the objectives and benchmarks been met? If not, you continue on with action planning within a strategic framework. That's your adaptive planning and management. If your objectives and benchmarks are met, then you ask, are your stakeholders satisfied? If not, you redress your stakeholder dissatisfaction until they are satisfied. Up on the upper left-hand side, you have this big bar called human resource development. Not everyone else, not all the stakeholders have a common understanding of problems and options and solutions. So you have to bring your stakeholders along, and human resource development is really important at all steps. Another example of a framework is by Julia Wondalek and Stephen Yaffe from University of Michigan. They've looked at ecosystem-based management and come up with this metaphor of bricks and mortar to achieve, to use an ecosystem approach and achieve ecosystem-based management. Bricks are those tangible factors that bound, organize, and guide a collaborative ecosystem approach process. They're explicitly defined niche and boundaries, organizational structure that ensures core needs are covered, and codified roles and responsibility. So the parallel then is that the mortar are those intangible factors that enliven and hold the ecosystem approach together. This is the nature of people and relationships, shared sense of place and responsibility, effective and rewarding process for all participants, and sustained commitment at all levels. Another example of a framework from the social sciences is from Kania and Kania, a publication in 2011, and they've developed a framework for cross-sector coordination to achieve large-scale social change. And through this, they've identified 5 conditions for collective success. So the first one is develop a common agenda for collective results. The second one is develop a shared measurement system. Third one, ensure mutually reinforcing activities, working together, ensure continuous communication, and then ensure necessary facilitation. So our team, organized a conference with a steering committee and a whole bunch of sponsors last fall. and we will share that URL with you again in the future. But the sponsors for this conference were everything from the Nature Conservancy to DFO for Canada, the American Fisheries Society, the Joyce Foundation, the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, the IJC, U.S. Geological Survey, a whole host of sponsors that you see on the screen before you. Day one was a normal conference that was a hybrid, both in person and virtual, where we had a series of papers presented on the ecosystem approach from all over the world. And our keynote speaker was Hugh Possingham. Some of you may know him. And then for days 2 and 3, we broke out into 7 synthesis working groups. First one was the origin of the ecosystem approach and challenges to implementing it. Second one was science policy solutions. Third one was education outreach and knowledge mobilization. Fourth one was blue economy. The fifth one was human dimensions. The sixth one was indigenous management systems. And then finally, technological advances. We asked them to go out and to review the scientific literature and the real world practice of the ecosystem approach and develop recommendations for better implementing it. So each of those groups are preparing a paper that'll be a special issue in the journal Aquatic Ecosystem Health and Management. And the recommendations from these groups, we're taking them, so to speak, on the road. And today is one of them. We want to share some of these recommendations, get your feedback on them. Is it still being relevant? How is it relevant and practical to you? So, how can we more effectively use the ecosystem approach in the 21st century? So here are some example recommendations from those 7 synthesis working groups. Organizational silos are necessary to reduce complexity to a manageable scope, but we need to work harder in bridging those silos. We need more investment in modeling alternative land and water uses, management actions, and policies to assess alternative futures. And we must go beyond ecological forecasts to include measures of human well-being. We need more economic valuation of natural resources. Whenever possible, we also need to establish proactive strategies and policies that build on our current scientific knowledge and lessons learned to prevent problems. We also need to put as much emphasis on the effective delivery of useful scientific information to policymakers as we do on the collection and analysis of scientific data and the creation of general scientific knowledge. We need to change the incentives for scientists to provide rewards for participating in policy-making processes. We need to incorporate traditional ecological knowledge into every step of ecosystem-based management. Scientists and policymakers need to become comfortable in taking action in the face of uncertainty and not abuse the precautionary principle. We need to ensure that Great Lakes managers and researchers engage teachers and students at K through 12 schools and institutions of higher education to offer experiential opportunities to learn about the ecosystem approach. We need to include Great Lakes watershed education in the curriculum of K through 12 students and in educator and teacher training for all Great Lakes states and provinces. We need to encourage watershed councils, conservation authorities, sea grant programs, and others to incorporate the ecosystem approach into their educational and outreach programs. We also need to challenge the federal, state, and provincial governments to update or develop an ecosystem approach policy and ensure that the ecosystem approach is incorporated into governmental continuing education programs. We must advocate for actionable science that is designed in collaboration with stakeholders to better inform ecosystem-based management. We should recruit the International Joint Commission, the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, and professional societies to establish a community of practice around the ecosystem approach. We should encourage comprehensive assessments of ecosystem health be undertaken in watersheds through partnerships to practice adaptive management. These assessments should include both status and trends of ecosystem health and how any improvements in ecosystem health have improved the lives of people living in the ecosystem. We should encourage governments and basin-wide organizations like the IJC, the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, the Great Lakes Commission, and other NGOs like Healing Our Waters to train facilitators of place-based ecosystem approaches throughout the basin. One of the groups I told you before focused on the blue economy, this sustainable use of the Great Lakes for economic growth, improved livelihoods, and jobs, and preserving the health of these freshwater ecosystems. Some of the recommendations from that synthesis working group leverage the capabilities of trusted institutions to convene regional leaders to advance the Great Lakes blue economy, strengthen collaboration among colleges and universities to develop tomorrow's water leaders, and maintain regional leadership in water technology expertise. Brand the Great Lakes blue economy to promote tourism and business investment and attract workforce talent. Improve the collection, analysis, and dissemination of economic data on the Great Lakes blue economy, and form a hub for information to support a blue economy. Those are some of the recommendations that came out of those 7 working groups. In our discussion today and in a follow-up survey that you can take later on, we'd like to hear from you is the ecosystem approach relevant to you today and in your work? In what ways is the ecosystem approach still valid, important, and actionable? And what recommendations would you like to see for more effective use of the ecosystem approach in the 21st century? At this point, I'd like to open it up for questions and for anyone who would like to comment and provide some answers to these questions for us. So maybe Roy can come back on at this point and we can answer some questions, and we would like to hear from you specifically.
Thank you very much, John, for your talk. So Julie included the survey link in the chat, and so as Dr. Hartig was saying, please complete the online survey in the days to come so that he can use this after the talk. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A box. I see that Nancy Goucher already included one question, so I'll start with that. I also have a question for you, John, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
But let me start with Nancy's. So Nancy's asking, do you know of any written documentation of co-production of knowledge, such as between the CCIW and McMaster, or with Clear and the Detroit River that you mentioned on your slide? So I don't remember which slide exactly it was.
Yeah.
You know what she refers to?
Yes, I do. So this co-production of, well, let's deal with Hamilton Harbor and CCIW. There's some really good papers that we can get, some references for you. But think of the work on Coots Paradise Marsh and some of the shoreline habitat in Hamilton Harbor that was done, where you had the Royal Botanical Gardens, you had CCIW scientists working with Bay Area Restoration Council to both, look at loss of fish and wildlife habitat, review the options, and then actually co-innovate solutions together. So yes, there are some papers out there, and there's a number of researchers we can point to you later. And the same thing goes true for co-production of knowledge and co-innovation of solutions around contaminated sediment. Here, we had Ken Drulard from the Great Lakes Institute for Environmental Research has been involved for over 30 years in this and helping move this forward. We just convened a major Stay the Straight conference last year on this topic, and showed how co-production of knowledge worked, and now they're into the co-innovation and including creative and collaborative financing of this. On the Detroit River, we have over 5 million cubic meters of contaminated sediment that have been targeted for some form of remediation. And the good news is that the Great Lakes Legacy Act of the United States will pay 65% of that cost, but that means not there. We need 35% from non-federal partners. So that could be cities and counties do not have any of that kind of money, discretionary money for that scale of funding. The state could be one. Obviously, industrial partners who contributed the problem will be at the table. So there has to be some creative and collaborative financing of that. So that's a good example of that. I'll be happy to share some links with you later.
Thanks, John. So in the chat, I see that your colleague also refers participants to the project page, so you can find that in the chat. So John, maybe very quickly building on what Nancy was asking you and what you were talking about co-creation, and then I see Sandra Cook also has a question for you. Just a very quick one from my side. How did you in that co-production process, to what extent are marginalized communities included in your discussions? For example, did they participate? And maybe I missed that on the overview slide with the various organizations that were there. Did they participate in your conference, for example? Yeah.
So yes, in that conference, we the Potawatomi, the Huron band of the Potawatomi participated. The Wyandot of Anadon Nation participated. Historically, we've not done a good job of involving First Nations in co-production of knowledge and co-innovation of solutions, but we're trying to change that. Similarly, environmental justice is a particularly pressing issue in Southwest Detroit, where there are so many industries, and the people living there have literally been living for almost their entire lives with a series of problems, from poor air quality to brownfields to all the trucks coming through that are creating problems for them as well. So that has to change. And we in the conference, we had people there from the environmental justice community to be part of this. We had the First Nations participating. So we want to do that much better of that in the future. In terms of on the Canadian side, Catherine Febria's Healthy Headwaters Lab is working closely with the First Nations here locally to co-produce knowledge and co-innovate solutions, and including joint teaching of classes together and trying to solve some of these problems. Probably the most exciting project that is coming up for this ecosystem is going to be the new Ojibwe National Urban Park. So at the table from the beginning will be First Nations and university researchers and governments, Parks Canada, Environment Climate Change Canada. So right from the outset of the project, before it's been formally designated, they're at the table. So that's going to be a very good example. And Catherine is a leader in working with the First Nations on this.
Thank you, John. I'm going to go to Sandra Cook. So she's asking in the Q&A box, there are community-based organizations that really want to move towards this ecosystem-based or watershed-based approach, but there are no funds available to these communities to help to organize this. Providing funding for community-led approaches is a key mechanism to advance these ecosystem-based approaches. As you are aware, or are you aware of any Canadian or Ontario funding that could support these organizations?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the problems with the funding of conservation authorities, how their funding was cut, and so they are clearly in a position to practice co-production of knowledge, co-innovation of solutions, and the ecosystem approach. So, yeah, we need to have a funding stream for this work. You know, on the U.S. side, they are obviously we can make improvements in this as well. And so funding, you know, budget manifests mission. And if our mission is to use an ecosystem approach and practice ecosystem-based management, the budget should, you know, make that clear. And we need more financial resources. So that's going to be obviously a major recommendation. And thank you for emphasizing that.
So Ajar Sharma has a question in the chat, and he asks you, how can we convince the policymakers in separate provinces to make negotiations and/or concessions while discussing watershed management in the ecosystems? What is the best way to transfer knowledge from the research to policy change?
Is getting them involved from the outset, you know, just like the Ojibwe National Urban Park. So before they're filling knowledge gaps, all the people are at the table. I think that is really instrumental. In Ashtabula, Ohio, that was one of the most contaminated areas around Lake Erie and the Great Lakes, and it had a Superfund site, you know, several chemical plants. So you can imagine the soil and sediments were a Superfund site. It was that bad in the United States. Then, of course, they had contaminated sediments from Ashtabula Harbor all the way out to Lake Erie. And nobody ever thought that they would be able to do anything significant about that problem. And the locals said, we can and we will. And they formed a Ashtabula River Partnership. And they brought all the industries in. They brought in the Port Authority. They brought in the local community and the county. And of course, the federal and state government were there as well. They had scientific expertise from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So they had regular technical expertise. So every step of the way, how big is the problem? What has caused the problem? We need to make sure Superfund does its job and those potentially responsible parties pay for that and clean up that portion. Then we need to go out. So there, they had tremendous amount of contaminated sediment, and they had to raise money to make the non-federal match. And that they created the framework and conditions for the private sector involvement. They had built enough trust where the federal government was the first one to put 65% on the table. The industries came in, the Port Authority came in, and they were able to do that. And they cleaned up the area. And it's one of the 9 areas of concern that have been removed from the list. And nobody ever thought that was possible. Same kind of thing in Hamilton Harbor at Randall Reef, the largest contaminated sediment problem in the Canadian portion of the Great Lakes. And there you had co-production of knowledge, not only bark, but you had all levels of government. You had the industries involved. You had the Port Authority involved. And they funded this, and it's now completed. And it is a containment cell in Hamilton Harbor where there is inward hydraulic gradient. Nothing is leaving that. They've capping it and turning it over to the Port Authority, where there are going to be economic benefits that will further the economy of Hamilton as well. So there's another good example of co-production of knowledge and co-innovation of solutions.
Thanks, John. Nancy is asking if you have heard of the so-called geographically focused initiatives established through Ontario's Great Lakes Protection Act. It doesn't include funding, but was meant to help apply an ecosystems-based approach to address specific water quality challenges at local scale. I don't think it has ever been used, but this may be a missed opportunity, she says.
Absolutely. It is a missed opportunity. And again, if we don't provide some resources, and through some of these recommendations, not only financial resources to these local watershed organizations or the Conservation Authority or even a new organization, but then governments can also provide a facilitator, somebody to help that organization go through the process as well. So the problem with those, and there's examples on the US side too, where there's language for unique initiatives, but no follow through in financing them.
Yeah. So Sandra is sharing with us in the chat that she reviewed the Elizabeth River project in Virginia. She says that this is a very unique community-led initiative in support of an ecosystem-based approach. And it highlighted collective impact networks, etc. I'm not sure if you heard about that.
That is, I do not know that one, but thank you. That's one of the things we're looking for. We would like to identify some exemplars of the ecosystem approach and ecosystem-based management. And, clearly, Fox River in Green Bay in Wisconsin is an exemplar in what they have done. And the Rouge River in Southeast Michigan, the first watershed where all 48 communities have stormwater permits now, and Hamilton Harbor being one. But we're looking for ones like, is it the Elizabeth River Project? We will look that up, and thank you for making that suggestion.
Great. Thanks, Sandra. Thanks, John, for all your insights. I'm just going to ask one last question. Maybe I don't see any Q&A questions anymore. I was actually triggered a little bit by your recommendation that we actually need these silos. I find that very refreshing, so to say, because you typically hear we got to break down the silos, but you actually say no, we need them because otherwise it becomes unmanageable, and so that's quite a statement there. The other thing that struck me was, and maybe you can clarify a little bit more this. What I didn't really understand was you were saying that policymakers or decision makers should stop abusing the precautionary principle and just face the music, face the uncertainties that they're dealing with. I wasn't completely sure if I understood you correctly. Often the precautionary principle is used to actually do something. But maybe I misunderstood what you were referring to.
Yeah,
can you maybe clarify?
That comes from one of the synthesis working groups, and they had an experience where the precautionary, in the absence of complete certainty of what is the problem, what is causing it, the potential impact of that problem is so significant that you act. And a good example of that is, virtual elimination of persistent toxic substances and zero discharge. In the absence of perfect knowledge, we will act. We're going to achieve zero discharge those because the consequences are so great. So I think in some cases they say that has been abused. I don't have a specific example of that, but that was the point they made.
Okay, perfect. Thanks very much for your clarification. Thanks very much for taking all the questions after your talk. So I'd like to encourage everyone, please complete the survey that was included in the chat, and John's colleague also provided a link to the project website for relevant background information. Thanks very much, Dr. John Hartig, for being with us. Very impressive. Many years you have worked on this. I read your article in Journal of the Great Lakes Research, the 35 years overview that you gave of the areas of concern. Very impressive to read all the work that you've been doing in this area. We're very, very happy to have you with us here today. I also want to thank all the participants today for being with us online again after the break. I look forward to welcome you again in exactly a month's time on the 15th of March. We'll have Nadia Kunz here with us. She's a professor at UBC, and she will talk about the value of water in the mining sector. So I look forward to see you all again in a month's time. Thank you all for participating. Don't forget to complete the survey that Dr. John Hartig sent around. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.